Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our midweek Bible class. We are continuing our look at omniscience. Last week, we looked at the scriptural data concerning omniscience, and I think we saw pretty clearly that Scripture teaches God, in fact, has all knowledge and seems to even have what we would call foreknowledge, some kind of ability to look into the future and see what is going to happen. And as we kind of foreshadowed last week, that brings with it some of its own problems. But before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about how the ancient world looked at the idea of fate and determinism, as we would call it in the modern day. Determinism kind of sounds like a very scientific word, determinism, but really this idea that everything we do is determined either by a biological response or by some greater being that is in control, that's really not a new idea. I'm sure if you remember back in your schooling days, you probably learned at some point Greek mythology, and they had the idea of the fates. The fates were these beings who kind of weaved the fates of everyone. Sometimes they would call it the thread of fate, or your fate was kind of weaved into the tapestry of existence. Now, depending on the version of the mythology, sometimes it would be literally everyone and everything is in that fate. Sometimes it would be just the important people are in that fate. But one of the big parts of the idea of fate was that could you overcome it? You know, that would be kind of some of the stories. Could this hero of the story overcome the fate that was woven for them by the fates? So this idea, this thing that we struggle with, this idea of being in control of our own lives, even though it's obviously a question raised by God's omniscience, it's not something unique to Christianity or Judaism. This is something people have struggled with for quite literally all of human existence. We've always wondered, are we really in control of ourselves? Or is this all something that is pre-planned? You know, is there this destiny for us that we just can't really change in any way? And I think when we look at the scriptural data, we saw that Scripture, even if it doesn't necessarily explicitly affirm that, has plenty of verses that would seem to uncomfortably line up with that, let's just say. For instance, in Psalm 139, verse 16, it says, "Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them." There, the psalmist seems to be implying that God has already planned out his life even before he's born. And that brings up uncomfortable questions. And so today we want to start looking at those uncomfortable questions of omniscience. The idea that God is all-knowing, the idea that God has all knowledge, that's really not up for debate for Christians. Scripture pretty clearly affirms that. We have to affirm that as Bible-believing Christians as well. But that doesn't mean that it's also, therefore, easy to understand how exactly omniscience plays out. There are plenty of problems that come with it, and Christians have approached them differently throughout history. So the first problem we're going to look at is this idea of fatalism. You know, is this taught by Scripture? When Christ says to Peter, "You're going to deny me 3 times," does that mean that therefore Peter has to deny Christ 3 times? Did Peter have the opportunity to say, well, Jesus said I'm going to deny him 3 times, but I've chosen not to deny him 3 times? Is that something he can actually do? Or when Christ said to him, "You will deny me 3 times," was that prescriptive? Was that Christ saying this is what will happen? You have no other choice in this event. And as we looked at last week, there are plenty of scriptures that would seem to imply this foreknowledge of God that would seem to also be foreordaining. That is, God says something that will happen, and it comes to pass just as God said it will happen. And so strong is this idea of foreordination in Scripture that there have been Christians over the history of the faith that have simply bit the bullet and said, you know what, human free will is in fact an illusion. No one really chooses what to do. God foreordains it all. Martin Luther is a somewhat famous example of this. Luther did think that human free will was not really a thing. And you might say to yourself, well, why then did he write so much about biblical stuff if no one actually has a choice? To which I say, welcome to the difficulty of omniscience. When it comes to things like determinism and free will, people really have a difficulty living consistent with their belief on both sides of the coin. So it's a tough question. But Luther, he thought that free will was really an illusion. And he's been joined by many, especially in the Reformed Christian traditions, who say God's foreknowledge is really only possible because God foreordains the events. That is, God decides what's going to happen. So therefore, of course, he knows what's going to happen. If I'm writing a book and I know what's going to happen, if I know this character is going to die this way in this moment of the book, then of course I have foreknowledge of what's going to happen. You as the reader may not have that foreknowledge, but I have the foreknowledge of what will happen. And so I can say what will happen, but that's because I have foreordained it for my book. And people who are in agreement about this sort of fatalistic view of God's foreknowledge will say that yes, indeed, God's omniscience, his ability to see the future, means that he has foreordained things. There are things that he has put down. They're going to happen. Nothing can change that. And therefore, he can foresee them because he knows exactly what will happen. And I think here we'd have to say that this, unfortunately, this is a logically consistent position with Scripture, but it's also a very, I think we would agree, uncomfortable position of Scripture. I don't think anyone likes the idea that we're not in control of our own actions. That's pretty uncomfortable. Even if that person in control is God, it's still uncomfortable. I'd rather be in control, being at fault for my worst sins, than to be a robot, kind of doomed to walk the world without a will. And yet there are parts of Scripture that seem to imply we don't really have that kind of choice. So how should we approach this? Well, here I think we want to pause and reflect on whether Scripture really does agree with this statement of foreordination. One of the most profound and I think disturbing conclusions of this view of foreordination, if we really do follow it to its end, is that God becomes almost inescapably responsible for evil. Even going back to the Garden of Eden. If all things are foreordained by God, then Eve never really had a choice when it came to taking that fruit, did she? In Adam, he was fated to take the fruit from Eve. There was nothing else they could do. That was what God had fated for them. And so the question becomes, how on earth can they really be held responsible for their sin if God is the one who ordained it? They didn't have a choice in the matter. They were no different than robots. I don't get mad in a video game if my character walks to the left, if I'm the one who pushed the controller to walk to the left. Now, if my character starts walking to the left when I haven't given any input commands, that's a problem. But if I'm the one who gave the command, I can't be mad at the character for doing that. And this seems to be kind of the same way we'd have to view God. If God was really in control of all this, if he foreordained it, well, then how on earth could he be mad at anybody for sinning? It doesn't make any sense. Moreover, it would seem to make God responsible for that sin. And not just for, you and me and Adam and Eve, but for literally all sin ever in the history of the world. God would basically become the most evil thing in existence on this view, if we take it to its logical end that way. If we really do say God foreordains everything, it would make God responsible for quite literally all sin. And that's obviously incongruent with Scripture. That is not a position a Christian can tentatively hold. Scripture is very adamant. God is responsible for no evil. God does not commit any sin. And so how could we have this view where God is both the one who makes us sin and yet not responsible for the sin? It doesn't seem to work. Now, that doesn't mean that thinkers like Luther and those who hold to the Reformed traditions like this never thought about that. Obviously, this problem of God being responsible for evil is one of the foremost to come to mind when we talk about God's omniscience and foreknowledge, and it's clearly unacceptable. And so there are plenty of Christian thinkers who have bent over backwards to get around that problem. And one of the ways that they will approach the problem is they'll say, well, God does foreordain events, but he foreordains them in a way that sin is the only outcome, but that the agent, or the human being in this situation, is the one who ultimately makes the decision to sin. That is, imagine if you were a car driving down the road on a nice, open, 2-lane, big, giant highway. Plenty of room in your car, anywhere to go. But say that the builders of that road made that road eventually narrow, until quite literally the car, no matter what it does, can't actually be on the road. The road becomes so narrow that the car has to be off the road at some point. Now, it doesn't really matter whether or not you, as the driver, have decided to veer off the road. Just by mere fact of you driving, you're going to come off it at some point, because the road itself just has nowhere else to go. The road is no longer wide enough to support you. And that's one of the ways that some thinkers on this issue will try to get around the problem. Well, God doesn't necessarily make you sin. God doesn't make you drive the car over that narrow part. You could stop the car, but then you're no longer living. Or in this case, you just have to stop living. But if you're going to keep going, then you have to drive over this guardrail. You're going to enter into sin. So God, He's not really responsible for you sinning in the sense of causing you to sin. He's just orchestrated events so that there's really no other way to get out of them except that you sin. And to be frank, I don't think this is a very good way around the problem. Semantically, it may help us escape the problem of God being literally responsible for sin. True, the driver of the car is the one still responsible for having taken that car over the lines of the road, over into the side. But really, if we really think about it, it wasn't really a choice on the driver's part. If you take your kid to the grocery and you say to them, you can have a Snickers bar or you can have nothing, that's not really a choice. The choice is between nothing or the Snickers. It's not like they can say, well, I'd really like a Fig Newton. I don't know of any kids that really like Fig Newton, but I can't have a Fig Newton. The choice really isn't there. It sounds like a choice, but in reality, there's really only one outcome. And if this is the case, if there's only one outcome for the situation, then even though God may not be responsible for the action itself, He's still responsible for the setting up for it. He's still forced us into a position where we fail. And it's still hard to see why He would be angry, why He would hold that against us as human beings, if indeed this is how it occurs. I don't get mad at someone for failing if I set events up where they had no other choice but to fail. I think of something like in Star Trek, what's the famous the Kobayashi Maru, that test where basically you were destined to fail. Now, the actual way around it was to just not play. You just didn't play it the way they wanted to. You broke the rules, so to speak. But if you were literally playing within the rules, you are going to fail every time. That seems to be the situation God's putting people in. He's putting them in a situation where they fail, but then when they fail, He's punishing them for the failure, even though there was nothing wrong with their actions. They had no other choice in the situation. Sin was the inevitable outcome. So I think that though this is a semantically better idea, it doesn't really fix the problem of sin being God's responsibility. He may not be the one causing it in this case, but He is the one orchestrating events to basically force it onto us. And so I think you begin to see the foreordination presents a really brutal ethical problem to Scripture. It brings up the issue, did anyone really have a choice when it came to sin? When David saw Bathsheba from his palace, did he have any choice when it came to sin? If he didn't, then why does God punish him for his sin? When Judas goes to betray Jesus, could he have done it any other way? And if he couldn't, then why is he punished for it? And it doesn't help that the Bible speaks of things like foreordination and predestination in very, I don't want to say vague terms, but hard to understand terms. As an example, Romans 8:29 says, "For those whom He foreknew, He also predestined to be conformed to the image of His Son, in order that He might be the firstborn among many brothers. And those whom He predestined, He also called. And those whom He called, He also justified. And those whom He justified, He also glorified." That's pretty strong language right there. It seems to be saying that God foreknew and predestined some people for salvation. And again, in Romans 11, starting in verse 2, Paul writes, "God has not rejected His people whom He foreknew, Do you not know that the scripture says of Elijah how he appeals to God against Israel? Lord, they have killed your prophets, they have demolished your altars, and I alone am left, and they seek my life. But what is God's reply to him? I have kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. So too at the present time there is a remnant chosen by grace. But if it is by grace, it is no longer on the basis of works, otherwise grace would no longer be grace. Once again, Paul brings up this idea of foreordination here, doesn't he? Paul seems to imply that, in the time of Elijah, God had picked a few thousand people. He had picked them out. And almost to this idea that they didn't have a choice in the matter. They were going to be the remnant whether they liked it or not. And then that brings up the question, well, why didn't God just pick everybody? Why did God allow anybody to be evil? Why didn't God just pick everybody and say, you're all going to be good now? You see the problems brought up by omniscience and foreordination. Paul is also not the only one to use this language in Scripture. In Acts 2:22, when Peter was giving his speech, and the long speech that culminates in the famous Acts 2:38, he says these words starting in verse 22, Men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God with mighty works and wonders and signs that God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves know. This Jesus, delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. Here, the foreknowledge isn't just about Jesus coming, tempting though it is to read it that way. Rather, the foreknowledge is really about the act of Jesus being delivered up to be crucified. It's not Jesus coming to earth. That we could kind of say, well, that's not that big of a foreknowledge. God kind of saw ahead and saw what he was going to do. But rather, it's the foreknowledge of the events which would lead to Christ being crucified. That's a whole lot more specific. That's pretty clearly involving the will and choice of human beings. And again in Acts 4:27, starting in verse 27, For truly in this city there were gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel, to do whatever your hand and your plan had predestined to take place. Once again, this is talking about the events surrounding Jesus, and they seem to be called predestined. Not that Jesus himself was coming, but the actual events surrounding his coming, surrounding his death, that they were chosen before time to occur. Again, in 1 Peter 1, Peter, beginning off his epistle, to those who are elect exiles of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, according to the foreknowledge of God the Father, in the sanctification of the Spirit, for obedience to Jesus Christ, and sprinkling with his blood. And then later in the chapter, in verse 20, Peter continues, He was foreknown before the foundation of the world, but was made manifest in the last times for the sake of you, who through him are believers in God, who raised him from the dead and gave him glory, so that your faith and hope are in God. So you see, this idea of foreordination, it is all throughout Scripture. Predestination appears so many times, and yet at the same time, whenever we go through Scripture, we see clearly that God cannot be held responsible for evil. God makes it clear he does not cause men to do evil. God only holds us responsible for sin we choose to do. So how do we reconcile that? How do we reconcile what seems to be a clear idea of foreordination, of predestination, and human free will? Martin Luther and people who follow his line of thinking, they just jumped over to the whole side of foreordination and just ignored the human will part. But that would seem to conflict with Scripture. That would seem to be against the idea that mankind is indeed responsible for their sin. If you just jump over to that side of foreordination, it seems that now God is really the one responsible for everything. And I don't think we can reconcile that with Scripture. But on the other hand, we don't want to join with folks who say, well, when the Bible talks about foreknowledge, that's just the ancients kind of not understanding how the world worked. Poo-pooing on Scripture, if you will, saying, well, they didn't really understand what they meant by foreordination. Human free will is a thing, and that's the one that triumphs all. God couldn't have made people do this because that would have been interfering on free will. I'm not sure Scripture agrees with that either. Scripture does seem to take the idea of foreordination and predestination seriously. So I don't think we want to agree with folks like Luther. Great man and great thinker though he was, I think in this case his idea was indeed against Scripture. I don't think we can say that God foreordains all of human history, all of human sin, all of human reaction, because it just brings up this incontrovertible problem that God becomes certainly responsible for evil. But we do need to come to terms with this idea of predestination, foreordination, and figure out how can we make sense of the scriptural view. And that's what we're going to look at, not just here today, but also in the coming weeks. I'm going to give you one view today, and then we'll look at others in the coming weeks. The first view I want to give you today is what we might call providentialism. If you know about the Christian idea of God's providence, that is, God steps in to provide his providence whenever it's needed. For instance, a miracle would be kind of viewed as God's providence in a situation. Well, in providentialism, on this view, God, who all Christians, no matter their beliefs, it doesn't matter what you believe, have always affirmed, God can act in history to achieve his purpose. Every Christian believes that. On providentialism, God takes this to kind of the next level. It's not simply God acting to, say, help Joshua in Joshua's time of need by making the sun stand still. Rather, God also steps in to, I hate to use the word mind control, but it's probably the easiest to understand. Let's say mind control people when he needs something to happen a certain way. An example of this comes to mind with Pharaoh during the Exodus. In Exodus 4, verse 21, and this is a theme repeated kind of throughout Moses' encounter with Pharaoh, we read this. And the Lord said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you do before Pharaoh all the miracles that I have put in your power. But I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. Here, God seems to say he is going to reach in and basically force Pharaoh to refuse to let Israel go. Isn't it? Doesn't that seem like what the scripture is saying? He's going to use his providence to enact a state of affairs where Pharaoh will not let the people go. And so, if you go forward and return to a verse like Acts 4, verse 27, where it talked about Pontius Pilate and Herod, and then verse 28 says that they were put there to do whatever your hand and your plan predestined to take place. Here, if we provide the providential interaction, it may not be that God fated things to happen this way from, say, the foundation of the world. It may not be that God foreordained this to happen from the beginning of the universe. And so, Pontius Pilate was always going to act a certain way, and Herod was always going to act a certain way. But rather that God intervened in the moment when necessary to make events occur to fulfill his plan. That is, God riles up the crowd to deny Jesus release and instead release Barabbas. Or maybe God hardens Pilate's heart at the right moment to ensure Jesus is not released. Maybe Judas is abandoned by God at the right moment so that he falls to sin. He accepts the offer of the priest to betray Jesus. All of these to make sure events play out the way they must happen. And in this case, God is not necessarily intervening in every single person. God maybe intervenes in Judas, but doesn't necessarily have to intervene in the guards who come to take Jesus away, for instance. They just come in of their own volition following orders. But Judas has kind of been controlled to complete this action. Sort of a selective providentialism, you will. If we go on to, say, David and Bathsheba, we might say that was not God's providentialism. It was not a providential occurrence. God did not force David to commit adultery with her. That was his own choosing. God does not just make a habit of mind-controlling people to commit evil. He's only intervening in the rare moments when it's necessary to make sure his plan goes exactly how it was going to be. So, for instance, when it comes to Peter, God probably intervenes there to make sure Jesus' prophecy comes to pass. When Jesus said, "You'll deny me 3 times," God makes sure Peter denies him 3 times. But when David goes out and maybe we should use someone like Saul, for instance. We won't pick on David anymore. When Saul is out and he's trying to go to war and he's waiting for Samuel to come, so that he can make an offering to God and find out if he's supposed to really do this thing or not, ask for God's blessing. Saul gets impatient and just decides to give the sacrifice on his own rather than wait for Samuel. On this view, God didn't make Saul do that. God is not intervening in every moment in history to make people do things. He's only doing it in places where there's a prescribed outcome, where he has foreordained something, and then he's making sure it happens. And indeed, I have to say, this view, though it may sound a touch convoluted, almost seems to be the one Paul endorses in Romans 9. In Romans 9, starting in verse 14, we read, "What shall we say then? Is there injustice on God's part? By no means. For he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. So then it depends not on human will or exertion, but on God who has mercy. For the scripture says to Pharaoh, for this very purpose I have raised you up, that I might show my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. So then he has mercy on whomever he wills, and he hardens whomever he wills. You will say to me then, why does he still find fault? For who can resist his will? But who are you, O man, to answer back to God? Will what is molded say to the molder, why have you made me like this?" Here in this section of Scripture, Paul almost seems to espouse a view very similar to the one I've just described, doesn't he? Paul seems to say God does indeed make some people specifically for the purpose of having them commit evil and do wrong. And on the opposite side of the coin, make some people for the purpose of grace. This is a fairly important text, for instance, for Calvinists who believe that God does indeed predestine some people for salvation and some for destruction. And we'll talk about that specific idea in a later class on omniscience. But here I have to think we have to admit, this really seems like Paul endorsing a view of God stepping in to decide how some people will react, forcing people to do certain things, whether for good or for evil. But here I do want to encourage you to keep the context in mind. Here in this particular section, Paul is not talking about human action, but rather salvation and grace. He's talking about God presenting grace to people who have not earned it, really. That is what the context of the scripture is about. It's about grace coming to really the Gentiles, the people who are not supposedly the people of God. In fact, that's what most of that chapter is about. And we'll return to that, I'm sure, when we get to the next challenge of foreknowledge about salvation and things like that. So we're not going to deep dive here. But I do want to encourage you not to read farther into the scripture than I think Paul himself was trying to make a point on. The point is not so much about God's providential choice, but the salvific choice, his choosing a certain people. Pharaoh is said to have been raised up for a purpose. But did you notice it doesn't necessarily demand that Pharaoh has to be evil for that purpose? You know, there's nothing in Scripture that demands Pharaoh have to have an evil, hardened reaction towards God. There's nothing in Scripture that says Pharaoh could not have said, you know what? God is the God of the universe. He is the God of heaven and earth. And these people are his people, and therefore I am going to let them go. Presumably, Pharaoh had that option before him. So then why does it say that God hardened his heart? Well, one way that we might get around this issue is we might recognize that hardening does not necessarily require action on God's part, but rather God knowing how Pharaoh's reaction would be to God's own actions. God knew that Pharaoh would respond a certain way to his command not to let Israel, and he wouldn't let Israel go. And therefore his heart would harden against God and his people. In fact, on this reading of the scripture, I would say there's no real need for intervention by God at all. It's simply him knowing his creation very well and knowing how Pharaoh would react. And this really is not that hard to imagine. I mean, I know how, for instance, my wife will react in most situations. I've lived with her long enough. I know her well enough. I know how she will react to someone saying this or that to her, or giving a choice of going to this restaurant or that restaurant. I know how she'll typically react in a given situation. And I, unlike God, can't see her innermost being, can't see her innermost thoughts. God has so much more knowledge than I do when it comes to these things. So for God to kind of take what we might call a very educated guess on how Pharaoh would react, I don't think we would consider that all that impressive. Now, I only bring that up as an argument against the reading of Exodus. I'm not really bringing that up as an argument against providentialism. I do think what Paul is espousing here lines up pretty well with providentialism. On this view, God does seem to pick some people and use them for his purpose in a way, whether they've really decided to join up or not. Some people do evil, whether they've kind of thought it out or not, because God has decided that's who they're going to be. And on the other way, some people do good and are found in God's grace because God has decided that's what they're going to be. And moreover, I do think that's a valid reading of Exodus alongside that. So the question then becomes, are there problems with this view? I mean, obviously this is not the only view of God's foreknowledge, God's omniscience. What would providentialism include? God, on this view, God knows all things, but he's sort of interacting with the world to make sure all things happen. So what are the problems with that view? What kind of issues bring up? Well, the first problem with the view, I think, is really the uncertainty of it. If God does indeed just step in at times to override human will when he needs to, how on earth could we possibly recognize that? How could we make How could we look at someone who has made a decision or done an action and say, okay, well, God made them do that, as opposed to, well, they just chose to do that? Moreover, how could we ever really know if someone or something is from God? How could we trust, for instance, that someone doing something, let's say evil, is really doing something evil of their own will, or if God is making them do that? To bring up a somewhat extreme example, how would we know that the Hitlers of the world are in fact acting of their own evil volition? What if God has some grand plan that he's trying to make happen? And FYI, I am not telling you to believe that. That is not a committal to that view. I'm bringing up problems with the view. How could we look at, for instance, someone going and committing a terrorist act and say, well, that was just their own volition. They just decided to do evil, rather than saying, well, God had a purpose for that. Because many of the events in Scripture that are called predestined include people doing evil things. I mean, Jesus being crucified is considered an evil act in Scripture. It has a greater purpose. Its purpose, of course, is eternal salvation, the good of all mankind, but the act itself is evil. And if we seem to think that God is ordaining these, then in the moment, no one could have looked to Judas and said, well, what you're doing is evil, because technically Judas was doing what God was making him do. Do you see the problem with the uncertainty that comes with this view? It almost proves too much, if you will. Basically, if you don't know what's going on, you can always throw up your hands and say, well, God must have made him do that. Moreover, this becomes very confusing in our own life. What if my actions have I really been responsible for? What if my actions has God been responsible for? What if my actions was of my own will and I need to work on and change, as opposed to God made me do it, and therefore I don't know if I can even do anything to change that? You see some of the problems that arise. In hindsight, maybe we could always look back and say, well, that one seemed to be from God, that one seemed to be from me. But in the moment, as I'm getting ready to do something that is maybe wrong, how could I ever say to myself, well, I need to stop? Moreover, how could we possibly make sense of scriptures, like, for instance, where God speaks to Cain and says, look, sin is lying at the door and it desires to rule over you, but you must master it. How could we make sense of that? How could we make sense of this idea that humans do indeed seem to have this ability to master ourselves if we never know what it is we're actually supposed to be mastering, what it is that God is either doing or not doing? The second problem with this view is that it still seemingly makes God responsible for some evil. Now, the evil God is responsible for here is obviously way, way, way less than if God is foreordaining quite literally everything in existence. But it is still something. Pharaoh's sin would not really be sin on this view. It would just be him doing what God made him do. Pharaoh wouldn't have gotten a choice. He's just a character in the book, so to speak. Now, there are ways around this. We could say, for instance, God hardened Pharaoh's heart, but didn't actually cause them to sin. That is, God initiated the hardness, but what happened after that was all Pharaoh. But if we take that view, God goes from kind of being responsible for sin to just kind of being unfair. In fact, I would say very unfair. It seems unfair to kind of provoke your kid and then get mad at them when your kid lashes out. That kind of seems unfair, doesn't it? If you keep prodding your kid, calling them names, attacking them, you can't then get mad when they turn around and respond in the wrong way, can you? Because you're the one who's been provoking them. But, again, Paul did seem to say that God maybe goes along these lines, that God does indeed bring some people up for grace and some people up for destruction. And as Paul said, the clay doesn't get to complain about what the potter shaped him into. And here I'd have to say on this second problem, it's really going to come down to what you're comfortable with as a believer. The first problem, I'm not sure if that problem can be surmounted. I do think it's logically consistent, but it's almost incomprehensible from a worldview standpoint. I don't know how you could live with the idea that God at any moment could step in and force you to do something. I don't know how you live with that. I'm not saying it's logically inconsistent. It is logically consistent, but it's really hard to see how you make sense of really reality in general on that view. This second one I do think is consistent as well, but seems entirely unfair from the view of the person who is being kind of forced to do whatever it is God is making them do. They didn't get a choice in the matter. Moreover, it does bring up questions of justice. If God forced Judas to betray Jesus, is it really fair that Judas is punished for his betrayal? If someone mind controls me to commit a murder, and they were literally puppeting my body throughout that whole event, is it really fair to punish me for the murder? I'm not the one who did it. I just was there. It was my body being used, but I didn't have any interaction. I think we kind of recognize that if human free will is to exist at all, then the answer to that has to be no. It's really not fair to punish someone for an action like that. Now, that doesn't mean that Paul was therefore wrong in his scripture. Paul's scripture, like I said before, is talking about raising people up for a purpose. Pharaoh was raised up for a purpose. People called to grace raised up for a purpose. But there's nothing in that that implies that therefore Pharaoh had to act a certain way, or people who are called for grace have to act a certain way. There's plenty of room in there for human free will and interaction. We'll get into that more when we talk about salvation in light of omniscience. But I do think this idea of providentialism, as I called it, is really going to come down to you as the believer and how comfortable you are with some of the statements in tension, if you will. Are you comfortable with the idea of not really knowing whether you've been in control at any point in history? Are you really comfortable with the idea of possibly being held responsible for something you didn't really do, something you didn't really have a choice in? Personally, I am not. I don't really agree with this view. I don't think that this is the scriptural view of omniscience and foreordination. That said, I do think it is a logically consistent view. An uncomfortable view, but a logically consistent view. So that's one view that we're going to have to encounter, and I encourage you to think about it. Think of questions. If you have questions about it, bring it up. Do some research on it. There's plenty of resources out there. This idea of predestination and foreordination, these are not new concepts. Like I said, people have been struggling with these since well before Scripture was even written. Even in the Old Testament, there were still people struggling with this idea of is this what I'm fated to do, or can I break beyond it? This is not a new issue, and I encourage you to do research on this. We'll talk about more views in the coming weeks. There are plenty more views, some which I find more palatable and more in line with how Scripture views the whole picture. This idea of providentialism certainly allows Scripture to hold to that view of predestination in a very strong way. If God can step in and control people when He needs to, then certainly when God foreordains something, He can make it happen. But I'm not sure it interacts well with human free will. I don't think it interacts with the scriptural picture of us as human beings making choices in our lives. So that's what we have here for today. Before we do leave, I do want to make a reminder. when it comes to that hard idea of predestination, the idea that we are in fact predestined and foreordained to do something, really the view of someone like a Luther or even a Calvin, where you don't really have a choice in the matter. When you sinned, you were always foreordained to sin. I think Christians need to reject that view. And I know that that's controversial to some people, especially people who consider themselves Calvinists. But I think it has to be rejected on scriptural grounds. I do not think there is room for that in Scripture, because at that point, I don't see a way around the logical problem of God being responsible for evil. And Scripture is clear. God is not responsible for evil. We are responsible for our choices. I don't think we can hold to the idea of absolute predestination for all things in existence. I don't think that can be held if you want to be a scripturally accurate have a scripturally accurate worldview. I think that needs to be rejected. But if you want a softer version of that, a more flexible version of that, I do think providentialism kind of fits into that, where you can kind of still hold to the fact that God does indeed foreordain some things, but those foreordinations are not common, they're exceedingly rare, and rather than having to deal with God being responsible for all of humanity's sin, we just have to deal with him being seemingly responsible for a few here and there issues throughout Scripture. So that's what we have here for today. That is Omniscience Part 2, kind of what we would call providentialism, I guess, dealing with the problems of foreordination and really the problem of fatalism. And next week we will look at another view that kind of deals with this. I'm not sure which one we're going to look at next week, whether it's middle knowledge or kind of the free will defense. We'll look at one of them next week. But until then, if you have any questions, you of course can ask. Sunday mornings is a good time to ask, write in, and we will deal with them there. Until then, I will see you guys in the next video. Take care, everybody.